Hey guys, good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are, whenever you are. We are going to take a look at the Unit 5 study guide here. So if you are playing along at home, again, this is not a required assignment for this unit, but if you are at home, again, in the Unit 5 folder, you can file, make a copy if you want to follow along. Again, kind of a key idea here is, as we go through the study guide, it's organized by section. And again, just to help you understand kind of to put things in place is following also the order of the Heimler videos and the naps, so you can use those as additional resources to help you out. Additionally, the AMSCO readings, I'm not going to go over every box, so if you want to make sure and fill out all the areas, again, find the section for the AMSCO reading. That's going to be a resource that's very helpful for you. So that's something to consider and to think about. The Unit 5, we can break it down into two major revolutions. It's an intellectual revolution with the Enlightenment, a new way of thinking, and that has real political revolutions that come out of it. And then also we have the Industrial Revolution, which touches and changes every aspect of life, not only in England, but in other countries as well, as the ideas and the inventions and techniques in the Industrial Revolution spread. Different countries have different ways to react to not only the Industrial Revolution, but also the Enlightenment. So again, kind of go through, if you want to follow along, I'll just kind of go through some of this here and add to the study guide. But actually what I should do is file and make my own copy so that you aren't getting, when you download the study guide, all the answers, which would be lovely for you, I'm sure. But there's value in this. Okay, so when we think about the Enlightenment, we think about a intellectual change, the way people think. We're taking tradition, the way things have always been done, and we're putting that under the microscope and saying, is this the best way of doing things? Applying ideas like reason and progress to think about, can we improve on the way that we have done things before? Is there a better way of doing it? It also developed into ideas that impacted politics. So if we had to, again, our buzzwords for the Enlightenment, we think about equality, that all people should have the same way of being viewed under the law. Of course, I put the asterisk on there because basically at this point we are just in the category of all white men, which was progress for the time, but certainly much more was to come. We think about liberty and that people have natural rights that cannot be taken away from them at birth. And John Locke, as we'll talk about in a minute, develops a political theory based on that idea. Progress. We are getting better. We learn from our mistakes. We take A and we look at A and say, how can we make B better? There is that idea from the Enlightenment that says that we are progressing, that we don't, as a human being and a human society, regress. And I don't know if that's always true, but that is the Enlightenment thought, is that we're on the up and up all the time. We have equality, we have liberty, we have progress, we have reasoning, which is to use logical thinking as much as possible, to where, again, you try to think of a conclusion that you take evidence and then come to that conclusion, very much like the scientific method. So we take that logical thinking and we do it that way. So we have equality, we have liberty, progress, reasoning. Oh, I've forgotten a buzzword. This is so embarrassing. What is it? It is tolerance. Okay. So tolerance, particularly in the field of religion. So you see a lot of religious tolerance movements coming. Some kings apply that to their territories. So all of these are buzzwords of the Enlightenment. Now, some specific ideas from Enlightenment philosophers. John Locke, again, was the idea that government protects natural rights. And if they don't, get a new government. The people have given the government the right to be able to protect their natural rights. That's the idea of the social contract, where the people sign away some of their freedoms to say, okay, government, protect our liberties. If they don't, you get a new government. Jean-Jacques Rousseau from France says the government should follow the will of the people. That's also known as the general will. So that is something that certainly develops over time. In order for government to follow the will of the people, they got to listen to the people. Part of that's going to be expanding voting privileges. Baron de Montesquieu says, hey, absolute monarch, you want to turn that into shared power and 3 branches of government. So, again, you take power in the government, you share it, you split it into predominantly 3 branches. That would be the best idea. Mary Wollstonecraft doing a little bit of thinking, and we'll come back to her here in a minute, but her thought is that education for women would then lead to gender equality. So while there was all this discussion about equality and liberty, like this asterisk, Mary Wollstonecraft started to attack it and say, well, how does that apply to women, right? How can we broaden the equality of the Enlightenment to include women? And she says that education is the way to do that. So again, we'll come back to kind of how we're seeing kind of parallel journeys for women through this period as well. So 2 ways the Enlightenment ideas are spreading. And again, just kind of an overview again is, you know, not all this information that we have and we're putting into the study guide here, we didn't do all of it in class, right? We just do not have the time. We do activities. We do skill-based things with the DBQ. We just don't have the time to go through all the content. So again, that's why your naps are so very important, because they give you all this other content from which to play with. So how are Enlightenment ideas spread? 2 ideas. Well, I got 2 for you. How's that? That's convenient. The first idea is the thought process that you had these things called salons, which were social gatherings for the rich. They would gather together and be like, what do you think of liberty, right? This is kind of their thought process, and they'd have these conversations. And the ideas would spread as people would talk and discuss. It's basically sharing ideas on Twitter in the 18th century. So they would have these social gatherings. The other way, probably the more effective way, is that kings would reform their countries. Okay, and probably the best idea of like a government enforcing Enlightenment ideas on the people would be Napoleon after the French Revolution, where he expanded France's territory and basically took Enlightenment reforms to all the places he conquered. So again, what we're talking about with Enlightenment reforms, I'll just put this here. We're talking maybe equality before the law, protection of free speech, equality of taxation, meaning that, hey, everybody pays their fair share or a certain percentage in taxes rather than, hey, the rich do nothing and the poor do it all. So all of that could apply there for Enlightenment reforms. Now, one thing that happens throughout this whole period of like, hey, you know, we should have our own liberty and we should have our own, prosperity to be able to rule ourselves, is you get the development of an idea called nationalism. Now, nationalism is going to take 2 forms. We're going to talk more about this. If you're watching the weekend that I published this, we're going to talk more about this next class. But what nationalism looks like is 2 ways. The first way is it's the right of an ethnicity or culture group to rule themselves. If I have the liberty to have free speech, then my kind of the logical extension of that is that my people, the people I roll with, we should have the right to be able to rule ourselves. Okay, so it's the right of an ethnicity to rule ourselves, and so this is very much like anti-empire. Okay, it is not very friendly to the idea of empire. It's going to kind of be something that kind of swells up inside of it to try to split it apart. But on the other end, nationalism is also considered a pride in your country, and this is going to be used by, say, Britain, France, America, Japan, as very pro-empire. So, hey, to have pride that we're going out, we're expanding our influence and territory, and then taking our reforms, whatever those are, to those people, that is a reason for pride. So that is a pride in their country. So we go on here and we see like this maybe an important point here, that the reform movements that the Enlightenments contributed to was the expansion of rights, expanded suffrage, which we'll mention here in a second, the abolition of slavery, which was something that came of age, and then also the end of serfdom. all of those things happened due to the spread of the Enlightenment. Colonies continued. So you did not see like this right of ethnicity to rule themselves. That didn't really take until later. This is still a very anti or pro-colony time period. Okay, and we'll get more into that next unit. All right, you also had in the period the demands for women's suffrage. So, for example, we talked about Mary Wollstonecraft already, where, you know, education is key. And then we also have in the United States another example where you have the fight for women's suffrage in 1848. So that's pre-Civil War. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott fighting for women's suffrage. That's something that the fight for that begins and is not going to take shape until later. We're going to look at a little bit more in depth at women's suffrage and that fight a little bit later before spring break to see kind of how women's rights develop over the 1800s and early 1900s. So you have that fight for women's suffrage starting there with the Seneca Falls Conference in the United States. Okay, so as we move to 5.2, people around the world, if you look at the causes and effects of the various revolutions, we're spending quite a bit of time on this in class here the last couple days, so I'm not going to hit this as much. I'm going to skip conservatives versus liberals. Well, basically, I'll kind of hit it here. The video is going to give you more insight, but conservatives are protect the status quo, so like a social hierarchy where you got the king and the nobility. It's basically feudalism. They want to keep it forever. 19th century liberals, we've talked about them already. They want to protect natural rights, which include property. They want voice for common people in government, voting rights for the rich. So you've got several things there for the liberals, and you can check out that video for more insight. We spent some time in class looking at the causes and effects of these empires. So I'll ask you to reflect on that graphic organizer that we did, if you want a little bit more insight there. Just real briefly to kind of for each 13 colonies, Haiti and Latin America as it's established here in the standards for us to look at. Of course, 13 colonies. I'll give one for each here. No taxation without representation. And again, we're thinking, how does this like connect back to the Enlightenment? So no taxation without representation. And one effect of this is practically French debt, and that's going to lead to the French Revolution. A cause for Haiti is they see the French Revolution, and as a colony, a French colony, which basically is all about the sugar, the French Revolution is an inspiration for Haiti. And the effect, it is the you could say the only slave revolt that led to an independent country. Okay, Latin America causes and effects. One cause, we'll hit this next class, but one cause is the Creoles, which are the New World-born Spanish heritage, basically. The Creoles looking for political voice. At this point, it's only the Peninsulares or the Spanish-born colonists that have any sort of voice. But the effect, and this is actually a big one, is the Monroe Doctrine, which is basically once Spain is kicked out of Latin America, the Monroe Doctrine basically says USA controls the Western Hemisphere and just stay out of our lane, basically. So that's kind of a big effect. And again, we'll go more into that in class. We also took some time to look at these how these documents reflected Enlightenment ideas. Let me stick on the Declaration of Rights of Man, since we didn't really hit anything on the French Revolution up here. But the Declaration of the Rights of Man in the French Revolution protects natural rights and personal freedoms. And then it also defines role of king, to rule with the voice of the people. So basically the king should be like listening to the people and follow the general will, which you talked about with Rousseau. So all those things kind of fit. Again, those are things you can look a little bit more into in class or with the other materials we have. So that also led to the growth of other independence and nationalist movements around the world. We're going to talk about German unification in class, so I'm going to leave this section for now. Again, if you want to go ahead and get detail in it, go to your NAPS, go to 5.2 in the AMSCO reading, and that can give you a little bit more. I'm going to take a short break. You won't notice it, but I'm going to take a short break and then get back to you here in a second. All right, I'm back. You didn't even know I was gone. Ha 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 ha. Okay, let's move on. So, Industrial Revolution. We did the urban game, and really the point of that activity was to see how technology helped grow the Industrial Revolution and also the issues that were created from it. But I think what's important to realize also is that why does the Industrial Revolution start in England? Okay, why does it start in Britain? There's 7 reasons there. It's listed in your standards. I want to talk about a couple of these that I think are less likely for you to understand, because 1 and 2 is like, okay, that makes sense. And even 3, like, okay, cities grew, right? We get that. 4, again, agriculture gets better. New machines like the seed drill make it easier to plant crops. So that means nobles will use all their land for planting. And what that means is they basically fence up some of their land, and they basically kick peasants off their land. Basically, they can't use it anymore. So where are those peasants going to go? Well, they're going to go where the jobs are. And the jobs are now headed toward the cities because of these new factories. So number 5, legal protection of private property. Parliament does not, and that's Parliament, again, Congress basically in England. Parliament does not take or does not, let's say, threaten private property. We think about the Enlightenment and the protection of private property. England was already there. And the reason why Parliament's not threatening private property is that the people in Parliament have private property. So they don't want a policy that hurts themselves. This is where it's important, where Parliament's making the laws and not the king. Okay, if the king's making the laws, he's going to take. Parliament's not going to do that. So that's going to allow people to use their property to be able to invest in capital. So the accumulation of capital, which is, of course, money, supplies, machines, factory, buildings. People can do that without being threatened by Parliament, because the people in Parliament are the ones that benefit from the wealth of the Industrial Revolution. So they are not going to be looking to kind of screw themselves through the policies that they create. And that allows England to jump ahead in this process. So the reasons for the shift to the factory system in a single location, well, we talked about it. Okay, so new textile machines do not fit in small houses, right? So new buildings needed for them, and the machines are powered by what? They're powered by water. So what that means is that the water, the factories have to be built on the water. You know what I mean? Not literally on the water, but at least beside them. And people will flock to the factories for jobs, which leads to the growth of cities. And voila, there you go. That's how we begin urbanization during the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so then you have the spread of industrialization. So just a really quick part, because a lot of this kind of builds into later. So it says here that the rapid development of steam-powered industrial production in the European countries and the U.S. contributed to the increase in these regions' shares of global manufacturing, while Middle Eastern and Asian countries continue to produce these goods, these regions' share in global manufacturing decline. So there's 3 examples here of places, and again, you can go to like 5.4, either the video or the AMSCO to get more detail here. But there's like, I think the one that speaks to me the most is here in India and Egypt. Textile production in England took off. Textiles, again, are clothes, right, that are being made in these factories. And because of the much more efficient way of making these from factories, predominantly hand produced goods in, say, India and Egypt, which for all of human history have been profitable and necessary. All these trade routes going to India and Egypt had hit up all those clothes productions in India and Egypt and other areas. So basically, British production will make it hard for these places to compete. So what that means is the wealth in global markets shift to Europe and the United States. The places that are industrializing can make goods faster, cheaper. They can sell more of them, which means they can lower the price, and then people will want to buy those, obviously, because they have more supply. They can afford to do that. So it's going to be hard for those in India and Egypt to compete. And like we've said, industrialization is going to spread from other parts, or from England to other parts of Europe and the United States, Russia, and Japan. So let's talk real quick about the technology of the period. We kind of hit this a little bit in the urban game, but the importance of different technologies and their impact on the world is really important for us to understand. So you have, first of all, you have what's known as down here, and I don't know why the standards put it in this order, but what was the first industrial revolution, which is basically 1750 to 1850. And this is going to bring us new technologies that change the game. Okay, so up here it talks about how the steam engine is extraordinarily important. And eventually the internal combustion engine. That's kind of the forerunner for what we have today in cars and you know, ships and other things like that. But they run on coal and eventually oil and gas. So these are extremely important in making the new industrial revolution really transform life. So for example, with railroads, let's do steamships first. So steamships allow you to sail upriver to expand avenues and efficiency of trade in that regard. Like now I can, get in my boat and go choo-choo up the river against the current, and that opens up new trade routes. So steamships are really important. Railroads transform society. There's no other way of saying it. They allow for quicker trade. They open up new markets for trade because now you can lay a railroad and go that way. But also you think about like socially, allows for more transportation opportunities, which, as we talked about in class during the urban game, leads to cultural diffusion, which again is the spread of new cultures. And it also is like, it creates a major backlash from conservative rulers. Conservative rulers, again, kind of want to keep the status quo, and they see railroads as something that are going to bring in new cultures and new ideas, and they kind of want to fight against that. Likewise, the telegraph. Think about the forerunner of the telephone. This allows for mass communication in a quick fashion. It was known as the lightning because basically this communication was done so quickly you didn't have to send write a letter and tell little Johnny to run down the road and give it to somebody. The telegraph allowed you to communicate through a Morse code type system to be able to transmit information a lot faster. So with the railroads and the telegraph, it's like the world is basically getting smaller. That, in essence, is what the major effect is. Now, that leads then to other technologies and what becomes known as the Second Industrial Revolution. And that's going to take place from about 1850 to 1914. And we didn't talk as much about this in class, but it is extremely important. And we talked about electricity a little bit in terms of like the street lamps. That was not technically electricity, but what it allows us to do is to increase efficiency of work because more hours are possible now. So that leads to longer shifts. Okay, so now you have longer shifts in factories that people can work in, and that's effective for people with electricity. It also just, it improves the quality of life. Think about it for us. When our power goes out, we're screwed. But now with electricity, it allows for better quality of life. Steel was a new kind of metal that is an improvement on iron, which was then used for railroads and particularly buildings. So now steel can be used to construct buildings. Let's say those tenement houses, which were such crap, now they can be built of steel, and that improves the quality of the buildings. When we talk about chemicals, we can look at like medicine improvements. We can look at better weapons. We're going to look at that in World War I. But there's also other things with chemicals that happen there. Okay? So that is technology. All right. Now, the next section and the next few are pretty important things that you need to have made sure that you have watched the Revolution Spreads Worldwide video, which is 15 minutes long, and you have a quiz with that. That's for if you're watching this in the year 2021. That's very important for you to check out because, again, we didn't have time to really talk about these things in depth in class. So how does industrialization change government's role from 1750 to 1900? So a couple things here. So as the influence of the Industrial Revolution grew, a small number of states and governments promoted their own version of state-sponsored industrialization, meaning that the government is paying for industry. That's not the case in England. It's not the case in the U.S. It's not the case in France or in other places in Europe. In this case, the government is financing these things. Other places, it's the bourgeoisie. Here, it's the government. Other places, the government's like, hey, do your thing. You don't have that bourgeoisie in these countries, so the government's stepping in and saying, if we want to compete, we got to make this happen. So Muhammad Ali, who's the leader of Egypt at the time, and is a part of the Ottoman Empire, basically says, you know what, to compete with England and these other industrialized countries, we got to have our own textile industry that is mechanized. So basically, he finances finances the construction of textile factories. Fortunately for him, cotton could be grown very effectively in and around Egypt, so they didn't have to trade for that. So they financed the construction of these textile factories. This came at a high cost for peasants in Egypt and those who were impoverished because taxes went really sky high to try to finance the construction of these factories. But in terms of an investment, the thought process was if we invest there, it's going to bring wealth to everybody. So the thought was to bring wealth to all. And for Egypt, it actually worked pretty well. But we're going to see in our next unit how their success is going to be short-lived. Maybe not of their own fault. So we'll get into that later. So again, the idea is it was an investment. Okay, so that's what's happening in Egypt. What's happening in Japan? So the expansion of U.S. and European influence in Asia led to internal reform in Japan that supported industrialization and led to the growing regional power of Japan in the Meiji era. So Japan, just for a little context, again, this video kind of goes through it. Japan is in a period from about 1600 loosely to 1850, is in a period called the Tokugawa Shogunate. The silver trade has brought Japan lots of wealth, okay? It has made them very successful internally, but at this point, once the Industrial Revolution begins, England, United States, Western Europe, they are going in a direction that Japan cannot meet, okay, because the economy worldwide is changing. But Japan has sealed themselves off due to protection of culture. Okay, so basically they're like saying, we want to protect our traditional culture. We've sealed ourselves off. We're not going to trade with anybody. Maybe some local people. They let the Netherlands in to kind of work with them a little bit. But Japan's basically sealing themselves off. Well, then in the year 1853, an American naval commander named Matthew Perry, I think I referred to him as William Perry in the video, which William Perry was a defensive tackle for the Chicago Bears in the 1980s. So he was known as the refrigerator. So I don't know what I was thinking. This guy's Matthew. And he shows up and he says to Japan, hey, knock, knock, open up. We want to trade with you and have a new place to share our goods with so you can buy our stuff. And Japan's like, no. And then Matthew Perry says, look at my ships. And the Japanese are like, oh, those are big ships. And there becomes a lot of tension in Japan to make this happen. And it does. So the Japanese open trade to the USA. But over the course of the next 15 years, it proves to the Japanese that they are behind. That the Americans, and by extension the British, the French, are mechanizing and industrializing, and they are behind, and there's a lot of internal strife and angst in Japan. So we get to the year 1868, and we have a revolution in Japan. It's called the Meiji Restoration. And in it, the emperor is restored to power over the shogun. And again, think of the shogun as like a military dictator. And the emperor is like the spiritual leader. So he's restored to power, but also with the Meiji Restoration, they develop a constitutional monarchy, very much like what you see in England, somewhat like what you see in the United States. Of course, we don't have a monarchy. But it's the sharing of power. So it's very much an Enlightenment idea. They also are going to industrialize. They develop factories. They build roads. They build choo-choos. Okay, trains. They're going to do all these things to really improve the nature and the status of Japan. And Japan, from this, they become an industrial power. They also eliminate the position of samurai. So this is a rejection of traditional culture in Japan, and it's a decision to say, we are going forward, we are industrializing, we are going to make Japan into a, quote, Western power to where we can succeed. All right, taking another break. You don't know it. I'll be back in this. All right, guys, back at it. So we head down to 5.7, and this is how the economy had developed and innovated in this industrial age. And so much of it has to do with the ideas of Adam Smith. Now, I want you again to kind of remember here. This is, oh, no, go away. Link. I didn't ask for you. Now I've screwed it up. There we go. Now, this is basically capitalism. Okay? What Adam Smith, for the most part, like this is capitalism. And just think of it that way. So Western European countries began abandoning mercantilism and adopting free trade policies, partly in response to the growing acceptance of Adam Smith's theories of laissez-faire capitalism and of free markets. So, one idea that Adam Smith says and thinks about, laissez-faire, which means practically the government should stay out of economic matters wherever possible. Okay, just stay out. Okay, because individuals have the capability to make economic decisions for themselves. Okay, so like that's kind of the big point, is that we are good enough intellectually to make decisions of what's best for us economically, and that's going to help not only us, but everyone. So an example of that is basically saying, okay, I am looking to, start a cupcake company, and, everyone loves cupcakes. Well, it's in my own interest to make those cupcakes as good as possible so that I can make money. But then if I make good cupcakes, then everybody else can enjoy good cupcakes. So we both win. There's like a win-win scenario here. Likewise, if a country is good at making one thing and a country is good at making another thing, specialize in those things and trade with one another. Don't try. So like, here's another thought. Don't try to be self-sufficient all the time. Okay, the thought is let other places be good at making something. So specialize and then trade for things you aren't good at. Okay? But then kind of the additional thought here and kind of the main thing is his idea of the invisible hand, which is letting the market dictate prices through supply and demand. So if I'm in Arizona and I start an umbrella company, it don't rain in Arizona. Why would I start an umbrella company in Arizona? I don't know, because I'm probably not going to be selling. If I'm just selling to people in Arizona, I'm probably not going to be selling many umbrellas. So Adam Smith says we have the individual reasoning to be able to make sense of that. And if we make bad decisions, then hopefully, Enlightenment idea, hopefully we progress to not make the same mistakes again. So let the market dictate prices. If something's hot, if there's a lot of demand, you raise the price. If then the demand cools off, you lower the price. We can make those decisions. Adam Smith thinks that the government making those decisions is inefficient, and then it leads to a loss of national wealth, because if everybody's being productive and everyone has the interest of being rich, it's going to lift all of us up. It doesn't have to be a top-down mercantilism thing, which is like, tax, gain all this wealth, have a strong military, and just like conquer everybody. You got to get everybody in your country on your team, and that's what Adam Smith is trying to do with capitalism. So I'm going to skip the transnational businesses. We're going to kind of get into that later. You can look at the more details. The group, though, the social class that wins, the social class that is the champion of the Industrial Revolution, is the bourgeoisie. These are the factory owners. They invest their own capital, which I kind of talked about what that is earlier. Like it's, their own money, their own resources, whatever that might be, to make a profit, and they do make that profit, and it leads to challenging political systems for a voice in government, and that is going to lead to the growth of suffrage, which is again voting rights. It's also going to create some tension between the rich and the poor. So you have growing economic inequality. But when we talk about lifestyle, when we think about the urban game, there were like museums, theaters, libraries, parks. I mean, basically, if you are rich, you don't have to work all the time. All right, and this is going to create a lot of differences going forward. Now, that industrial economy that's being created, there's reactions to it. Okay, so in response to the social and economic changes brought by industrial capitalism, some governments, organizations, and individuals promoted various types of reforms. You start to see, and there is like a lot of examples of this. We think about European middle class people. There's a fellow we're going to talk about on our next class from Germany named Otto von Bismarck, who also kind of follows this idea that government should be used, sometimes to address the problems, all right, that are existing. So some of the reforms that, we talked about, improved sanitation and cleaning of streets. You want to prevent, that cholera that's coming through. You get that poop in the water, so that's something that a government should do. You should also have the reforms of like protecting the factory worker, and that can take many different forms. That can be like child labor laws. That can be limits on work hours. That can be unemployment insurance. It's a lot of different things there that, like, a government could say, okay, here's some reforms that we chase. And I don't know, I don't know if I don't think I get into it later, but it's also the expansion of voting rights. Because when people can vote, government has to listen to you. We talk about women's suffrage being such a big thing. It's like, why do women want the right to vote? It seems obvious for us today, but the key was that governments would now have to listen to the issues that affected women in particular, something like that. So that's something that is really key and really important to consider as well. Labor unions, we talked about that. Labor unions really, you can look at that website, but really the one thing I'll say is that they push for these reforms to happen. And you can see that, some of those reforms are in there, but they are another voice, these groups of workers that come together after the factory owners from the urban game really made their life hell. They're going to come together and try to push for different rights. And that's a big story in American history, is kind of the role of labor throughout history and what actually happens from it. Now, communism. Okay. So you get this dude named Karl Marx. Let me give a little bit of background here. So Karl Marx is writing against capitalism because he sees that all conflict in human history is created by economic inequality. So he sees two classes here, right? He sees the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. And he sees this disconnect between the two. Okay, the proletariat is basically creating the wealth, and the bourgeoisie is benefiting from it. That they're the ones that are gaining all this wealth and all this production, and they're benefiting from all that. So he is writing against this system, and he sees eventually that there's going to be change because of the oppression that is being put on the working class, again, the proletariat. So he's writing against the system of capitalism. So in terms of his process, he sees violent revolution to overthrow the bourgeoisie. To basically take, and again, he's not differentiating here between nobles who are the people who own the land in the rural areas that we've talked about a lot. He's not saying it's them versus the bourgeoisie, the factory owners. He's lumping them all together. They're the ones that control the means of production, right? The way that you make money. So there's going to be a violent revolution to overthrow the bourgeoisie, okay? And then you're going to get proletariat leaders that come together to try to redistribute wealth to all the proletariat. And once that ability to create wealth is redistributed, then a communist society, but it comes to the word commune, where it's basically we're all living here together and sharing everything. So sharing all things, no private property, and if there's no private property, there's no status, because our status is defined by what we have. And it's basically to each according to his need, meaning that you only get what you need, right? And you are willing to share what you have, because you don't have it really. It's all of ours. You share anything you have with those in need. And this is a communist society. So this is what Karl Marx sees, that industrial economy is going to put so much stress on what's going on. He's eventually going to see a basic overthrow of the system and create communism. Now, when we think about this word today, we think about, oh, it's this totalitarian strong government that basically, directs the lives of all the people. That's not what Marx was thinking, because in his system, there is no need for a government. So there ends up not being a government at all, according to Karl Marx. And that is something that makes his vision different than what, say, the Soviet Union or Cuba, North Korea, these other communist countries that exist. they never get beyond this stage. Okay, they never get beyond the redistribution from the proletariat leaders, which becomes the communist government. So we have never seen on a national scale step 3 in a country that attempts to turn into a communist government. One other note I'm going to put up here that I left out. Socialism is an economic philosophy that redistributes wealth to the poor. Okay, socialism is an economic philosophy that redistributes wealth to the poor. They kind of shift things around. They raise taxes on wealthy to create programs. So socialism is kind of a feature of communism, but it does not imply that we go basically all the way. Okay, and communism is like total redesign of society. Socialism is an economic philosophy. Okay, so real quick, let me talk about, in response to the expansion of industrializing states, some governments in Asia and Africa sought to reform their economies and militaries, and there was sometimes resistance to that. Well, that's true. So in China, we have the Qing dynasty, which we have mentioned a little bit before. They take over in 1644, and they're going to rule till 1912, just to give you perspective. And basically, the Qing dynasty is growing weak from constant European influence. Remember, with China, they're consistently trying to stay within, right? And not expand because of Confucian ideas. But you've got the Europeans, like, just sneaking around the Far East like little annoying birds, just pecking at the Chinese, trying to get economic influence. So there's a period of time called the self-strengthening movement, which attempts to modernize the Chinese military and tax systems, and limited efforts at industrialization. It is not what Japan does with the Meiji Restoration. They try just a little bit to say, okay, we're just kind of tired, right, of being pushed around. And we're going to talk about next unit, the Opium Wars, which basically trigger this way of thinking. They're growing tired of being kicked around basically by all the Europeans. So it's limited efforts of industrialization. But the Empress, and her name is Siqi, leads resistance to this movement. And like I said, it's going to create internal rebellion against modernization. We're going to talk about the Boxer Rebellion next unit as well. So China basically is like the culture and modernization are really having a tug of war. And the self-strengthening is trying to like play the middle ground, but it ends up making everybody angry because you're not either fully industrializing or like staying the way you are. So it's gonna be kind of a mess. Also a mess is the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is basically known as the sick man of Europe, and they're just in big trouble. You have growing nationalism throughout the empire, meaning that you have a lot of ethnicities are like we don't want to be a part of this empire anymore. We want to do our own thing, and it's really difficult. So there are some reforms called the Tanzimat reforms, which are put into place, which attempt to clean up corruption. And let me get like a little reminder because Tanzimat. Let's see what else we got here. Let's scroll down. Just let me get one or two other things. Oh, yeah, that's it. Okay. So the big thing was to reduce the influence of Islam in the government. So to create a more tolerant, Enlightenment idea, tolerant, secular or worldly government. But there really was, and there were also, again, limited attempts at industrialization, building those railroads and such. But there was resistance from a group called the Young Turks, who were seeking more democratic reforms. they're really looking to push the Ottoman Empire in a direction that a lot of European countries are going, which is, shared power in government and things of this nature. All right, one more short break, and then we'll be back to finish. Okay, finishing up now, and I think this last section we have done a fairly good job at doing, particularly the one at the bottom, the 3 problems that the urban game created. New social classes, we did that, and we are going to take some time before the break to really talk about how women's roles are transforming in this period 5, which is 17, or this unit 3, rather. Well, no, period 3 of AP World History, which is both units 5 and 6. I'm going to let you, again, nap for 5.9, and then the video link to kind of fill in the gaps, because we're at 50 minutes, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. Again, kind of to if you're watching parts of this, elements of this before our unit test, just remember you've got 2 things happening. You've got the Enlightenment, which is triggering these political revolutions, which are spreading new freedoms and liberties, and also spreading nationalism throughout the world. But you also have the growth of the Industrial Revolution, and that's changing every nature of society, every part of society, including what is the economy, or who does the economy work for? What is the government's role in maintaining the economy? How does the government react to social problems? How do foreign countries outside of where the Industrial Revolution began in Western Europe, how do they respond to these changes? They could go Japan's route and embrace them. They could go China's route and just kind of play that middle ground. So that is really the essence of this unit, is looking at the changes that the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution bring. Hopefully it was helpful. Yell at me as always if you got questions. We'll see you later. Bye.